It was nearing the end of evening mass when Father Adrian first noticed him. Among the bowed heads and folded hands, there he stood, silent, still, watching. Not in defiance, but with a sort of intense reverence that unnerved Adrian more than a reverence ever could. The stranger occupied the third pew from the front, alone, his eyes fixed on the altar as though he were praying not to God, but to the man who served him. Adrian's hands trembled slightly as he raised the chalice. He disguised it as fatigue. The church was warm with candlelight, and the fragrance of incense clung to the walls like memory. After the final blessing, parishioners filtered out in soft clusters, some lingering for confession, others offering gentle greetings as they passed. But the man remained seated, unmoving, a shadow clothed in navy wool and quiet curiosity. As Adrian extinguished the altar candles, he caught himself glancing over. Once. Then again. He told himself it was pastoral vigilance. He had always been attentive to new faces, to those who came seeking something more than ritual. Yet when their eyes finally met, something unnamed and dangerous flickered between them, something that felt neither holy nor wrong. The man rose with deliberate grace, walking the narrow aisle as if he belonged there. His voice, when he spoke, was low and unhurried. "Beautiful homily, Father." "Thank you," Adrian replied, fighting the instinct to avert his gaze. The man's presence was disarming, like stepping into a familiar room and finding all the furniture moved. "I'm Elias," he said, extending a hand. "I'm new to the neighborhood." Adrian shook it, the contact brief but vivid. "Welcome. I hope you find peace here." Elias offered a small smile. "I'm not sure I'm looking for peace." Adrian didn't know how to respond to that. He only nodded and watched as Elias stepped out into the chill of the early spring evening, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a softness that belied the storm he left behind. That night, Adrian lay in bed longer than usual, rosary untouched on the nightstand. He prayed without words, asking for clarity, strength, silence, anything that would drive the memory of Elias from his mind. But it clung to him, insolent and persistent. The shape of his smile, the strange intensity in his eyes, the way Adrian had felt, seen, not as a shepherd or symbol, but simply as a man. The following days brought Elias back to Massachusetts. He arrived quietly, always alone, and left before Adrian could decide whether he wanted to speak to him again. But each time, Adrian felt his presence before he saw him, a subtle change in the air that left him breathless and unnerved. And each night, sleep came later and less peacefully. Adrian tried to busy himself. He doubled his visits to the hospital, increased his hours at the shelter. He took longer shifts in the confessional, where the sins of others might drown out his own rising tide of confusion. But even the whispered grief of strangers couldn't silence the voice growing louder inside him, the voice that asked, again and again, what if this is more than temptation? One afternoon, as he locked up the side chapel after a quiet wedding, he found Elias waiting at the gates. This time, he didn't look like someone seeking solace. He looked like someone offering it. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Elias said, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "I just wanted to talk." Adrian hesitated. The rules were clear, but the lines were not. A priest could speak to anyone, offer counsel, listen. "I have a few minutes," he said. They walked the garden path behind the church, a narrow trail flanked by winter roses just beginning to bloom. Elias spoke of his move to the city, of losing his father last year, of wandering between churches hoping one would feel like home. "I'm not very good at faith," he admitted, stopping beside the old stone bench. "But I'm drawn to it. Or maybe to people who carry it like it still matters." Adrian sat beside him, not too close, but close enough to feel the tremble in his own resolve. Faith isn't about being good at it. It's about showing up. Elias looked at him, then really looked. And what if showing up leads you somewhere you're not supposed to go? Adrian's breath caught. The bench beneath him felt suddenly fragile. "Then," he said slowly, "you pray for strength to stop. Or the courage to follow." The silence that followed was long and tender and unbearable. Elias didn't press. He only nodded, stood, and offered a quiet goodbye. As Adrian watched him go, he realized the conflict wasn't new. It had been waiting all along, hidden in quiet prayers and careful denials. Elias had only given it a name, and now that name was everywhere. Elias didn't linger after Massachusetts. He never did. Adrian watched him from the sacristy window as he slipped out with the crowd, shoulders hunched slightly beneath his coat, a figure blending into the ordinary as if he hadn't just reshaped the center of Adrian's world by simply showing up. It had been 3 Sundays since the letter. 3 weeks since that quiet, gentle plea that Adrian still hadn't answered aloud. But each week, Elias returned. Always early, always alone. He never approached, never tried to speak. And yet Adrian could feel the gravity of his presence with every breath he took behind the altar. Their silence became a form of communication, a strange liturgy known only to them. The soft glance exchanged before the procession. The flicker of hesitation when Elias passed by the baptismal font. The way Adrian lingered after the final hymn, heart thudding with unspoken things. It wasn't enough, but it was something fragile, forbidden, and precious. On a rainy afternoon near the end of April, Adrian found Elias again, this time not at church, but outside the corner bookstore on Lincoln Street. The priest had wandered there without purpose, seeking solitude among pages. He didn't expect to see Elias, brows drawn as he flipped through a slim paperback near the philosophy shelf. They noticed each other at the same moment. Neither smiled. They didn't need to. Elias tucked the book under his arm. Didn't expect to see you here. I could say the same. They stood like that for a breath. 2 men in a public space, one marked by the collar at his throat, the other by the longing in his eyes. Walk with me? Elias asked. Adrian nodded. They moved quietly through the wet streets, the rain falling in a steady hush. There was no small talk. No veiled phrases or half-truths. The air between them had grown too dense for that. Eventually, they paused beneath a tree in the park where spring had started to bloom in pale green buds and scattered petals. I've been thinking, Elias said, voice soft, about what this is. Adrian's pulse quickened. It can't be anything. I know, Elias said. Then more gently, but it already is. The priest closed his eyes. He wanted to deny it, to run from it, to gather the robes of his faith around him like armor and pretend he was untouched. But he couldn't. Not anymore. I can't leave the church, he whispered. I'm not asking you to. I can't, Elias. I've made promises. Vows. They're not suggestions. I know, Elias repeated. But have you also made peace with them? Or have you just endured them because it was easier than being honest with yourself? Adrian flinched, not from anger, but from recognition. The truth of that question struck too deep, too close to what he'd avoided for years. He had buried desire beneath devotion, hidden longing inside prayer. And still, it had found him. This isn't just about desire, he said finally. It's about identity, legacy, souls. I am responsible for more than just myself. I know you are, Elias said, stepping closer. But you're also responsible to yourself. Don't forget that. Adrian stared at the ground, the mud soft around his shoes. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to lean into something warm and certain, but every instinct screamed restraint. He looked up at Elias then, and the ache in his chest sharpened. If I could be someone else. You don't need to be someone else, Elias cut in. You just need to be honest about who you already are. There it was, laid bare, unvarnished and undeniable. A confession without a booth. A truth that offered no penance, only clarity. They parted with no promises, no declarations. Just the quiet agreement that something had shifted. That night, Adrian didn't go to the rectory chapel. He didn't light candles or recite psalms. Instead, he sat in his study, the letter from Elias in one hand, a blank sheet of paper in the other. His pen hovered over it for nearly an hour before he finally wrote 3 words. You were right. He folded it, sealed it, but didn't send it. It was enough, for now, to admit it to himself. Still, sleep evaded him. His thoughts circled in loops: what the bishop might say, what his congregation might feel, what God might think. But beneath all that fear was something else. A strange, unwelcome hope. And hope, Adrian knew, was far more dangerous than sin, because it dared you to believe that something else might be possible. The next morning, as the church filled with the scent of fresh lilies and warm wax, Adrian stepped out into the sanctuary and saw Elias once again in the third pew. For the first time, Adrian didn't look away. Adrian avoided the bench after Massachusetts. 3 days. He told himself
Adrian
it was
watched
a matter
him
of
from the
sacristy
routine.
window as
There
he
were
slipped out
always
with
excuses,
more
shoulders
counseling
hunched
sessions,
slightly beneath
an
his
elderly
coat,
parishioner
a
recovering
figure
from
blending
surgery,
into the ordinary,
a stack of
as if he
diocesan
hadn't just
paperwork
reshaped
that
the
begged his
center of
attention.
Adrian's world.
But deep
by
down,
simply showing
he
up.
knew it was fear.
It had been 3
not of
Sundays
Elias
since the letter,
but of the way he'd
3
felt
weeks
on that
since
bench.
that quiet,
Open,
gentle plea
unguarded,
that Adrian
vulnerable
still
in a way that
answered
robes
aloud.
and rituals
But
could
each
no
week,
longer shield.
Elias returned.
The garden stayed
Always
silent
early,
without him.
always alone.
The roses
He
continued
never
their
approached,
slow bloom,
never tried
untouched
to speak,
and
yet
unobserved.
Adrian could feel
But
the gravity
each
of
evening,
his presence
when he
with
crossed the
every
nave
breath
alone.
he took behind
Adrian
the altar.
found himself
Their
glancing
silence
toward the
became
back
a
pew
form of
where
communication,
Elias once sat,
a strange
and
liturgy
each time he
known
found it
only
empty,
to them.
he was
The
surprised
soft
by the
glance
small
exchanged
ache it left
before the
behind.
procession.
Then
The
Thursday
flicker
of
came.
hesitation.
It was late,
when Elias passed
long after
by the
confessions had
baptismal
ended.
font.
When
The way
Adrian stepped
Adrian
outside
lingered
for
after
air,
the final hymn,
the sky was veiled with
heart-thudding
low
with
clouds,
unspoken things,
thick with the scent
it wasn't
of coming
enough,
rain.
but it was
He
something
didn't expect to find
fragile,
anyone lingering,
forbidden, and
but there
precious.
he was,
On
Elias,
a rainy afternoon near
leaning
the end
against
of
the
April,
stone archway,
Adrian
a
found
cigarette
Elias
barely
again.
lit between his
This
fingers.
time not at church.
You shouldn't smoke
but
here.
outside the corner
Adrian
bookstore
said
on
softly,
Lincoln Street.
though he didn't sound
the priest had
reproachful.
wandered there
Elias
without purpose,
smiled,
extinguishing
solitude
the cigarette
among
against
pages.
his boot.
He didn't
Old
expect
habit.
to see Elias.
I didn't think
Brows
anyone would
drawn
see.
as he flipped through
Adrian
a slim
folded his
paperback
arms across
near
his
the
chest,
philosophy shelf,
unsure whether
they
to
noticed
stay
each other
or go.
at the same moment.
Why are you here?
Neither smiled.
I wasn't sure I should
They
come
didn't
back.
need to.
Elias
replied.
tucked the book
But
under his
I
arm.
could not.
Didn't expect
I've
to
never
see
met
you
someone
here.
who made me feel
I
like
could
I
say the
might
same.
actually belong
They
somewhere.
stood like that for a breath.
Adrian shifted.
2 men in a public
discomfort
space,
crawling
one
under
marked
his
by the
skin.
collar at his throat.
I'm not what you think
the
I
other
am.
by the longing
You're
in
kind.
his eyes. You listen.
Walk with me.
You look at people
Elias
like they
asked.
matter.
Adrian
That's
nodded.
more than I've
They
gotten from
moved
most
quietly
priests.
through the wet streets.
That doesn't make
The
me
rain
immune.
falling in a
Adrian
steady
said,
hush.
his voice low.
There was no small
Elias
talk.
stepped forward.
No veiled
Not
phrases
threateningly,
or half-truths.
not even boldly.
The air between them
Just
had
close
grown
enough
too
to make the
dense for
silence
that.
between them
Eventually,
feel electric.
They paused
I
beneath
never
a
asked
tree
you
in
to
the park
be.
where spring
It
had
wasn't
started
a
to
seduction.
bloom in pale
It
green
wasn't even a
buds and
confession.
scattered petals.
It was a truth.
I've been thinking,
simple and
Elias
raw,
said,
delivered
voice soft,
without expectation,
about what this is.
And somehow
Adrian's
that made it
pulse
harder to
quickened.
bear.
It
Adrian
can't be
turned away.
anything.
I took vows.
I know.
I meant them.
Elias said.
I
Then
know.
more gently.
I believe in
but
them.
it already is.
I know.
The priest
I can't
closed
break
his
them.
eyes.
Elias
He wanted to
didn't
deny
answer.
it.
To
He
run
only
from it.
exhaled slowly
To gather the robes
and
of
step
his faith
back into
around
the
him
shadows,
like armor,
letting
and
Adrian
pretend
breathe again.
he was untouched.
But the emptiness
But he
that
couldn't.
followed was louder
Not
than
anymore.
anything Elias
I can't
could have
leave
said.
the church
That
he
night.
whispered.
I'm
Adrian
not
sat
asking
before
you
the
to.
crucifix
I
in the
can't.
rectory chapel.
Elias,
Candlelight
I've made
flickering
promises.
across the carved
Vows.
figure of Christ.
They're not suggestions.
His prayers were no
I
longer
know.
composed.
Elias
They
repeated.
came out in fragments.
But have you also made peace with
half-spoken
them?
pleas for
Or
guidance,
have you
for
just
forgiveness,
endured them
for
because
escape
it
from
was
the chaos
easier than being
he'd
honest
let
with
into his
yourself?
soul?
He
Adrian
wanted to forget
flinched,
Elias's
not from
voice,
anger, but from
forget his
recognition.
warmth. The
Forget
truth
the
of
way
that question
something
struck
inside him
too
had
deep,
shifted,
too close
not
to what
lust,
he'd avoided
not
for
fantasy,
years. But the
he had
awful,
buried desire,
tender
beneath
realization
devotion,
that he wanted
hidden
more,
longing
that the
inside
man
prayer.
who had always been
And
content
still,
to serve
it had
had
found
suddenly
him.
longed to be
This
seen,
isn't just about desire,
not as a
he said
vessel for
finally.
others' faith.
It's about
but
identity,
as someone deserving
legacy,
of his own.
souls.
And beneath it all
I
was the
am
question
responsible
that wouldn't
for more
leave
than
him.
just myself.
If love itself
I know
was not
you
a
are,
sin,
Elias
then
said,
why did it feel
stepping
like
closer.
drowning?
But
The
you're
next
also
morning,
responsible to
he
yourself.
found a letter tucked
Don't
beneath
forget
the
that.
chapel door.
Adrian stared at
Elias's
the ground.
handwriting was small,
the mud soft
careful.
around his shoes.
I'm sorry
He
if
wanted
I
to
crossed
reach
a
out.
line.
He wanted
That
to
wasn't
lean
my
into
intention.
something warm and
I just
certain.
needed you to know
But
that
every
meeting you
instinct
reminded me
screamed
I'm
restraint.
still capable of
He
hope.
looked up at
That
Elias
someone
then,
like you
and the
exists,
ache in
kind,
his chest
brave,
sharpened.
afraid, and
If I
still
could
standing,
be someone else,
makes the city feel
you
a
don't
little
need to
less
be someone
cold.
else.
I won't
Elias
come
cut
back
in.
unless you want me
You
to.
just need to be
Adrian
honest
held
about
the
who
letter
you already
a long
are.
time.
He
There
read
it
it
was,
once,
laid bare,
then again,
unvarnished,
then
and
folded it
undeniable.
slowly,
A confession
placed it in
without
the
a
breast pocket of his
a truth
cassock,
that offered
over
no
his heart.
penance. He didn't
Only
answer.
clarity.
Not
They
that
parted
day.
with no
Not the
promises,
next.
no declarations.
But on Sunday morning,
just the
as
quiet
sunlight
agreement that
streamed
something
through
had
the
shifted.
stained glass windows
That
and
night,
the organ hummed
Adrian
softly
didn't
in the
go to the
background.
rectory chapel.
Adrian stepped
He
up
didn't
to the
light
pulpit
candles or
and
recite
began his
psalms.
homily.
Instead,
his hands no
he
longer
sat in his
trembled.
study, the
His
letter
voice
from
was
Elias
clear.
in one hand.
He spoke of mercy,
a blank sheet of paper
not
in
the
the
kind
other.
that washes
His
away
pen hovered
wrongdoing,
over it for
but
nearly
the
an
kind
hour
that sits
before he
quietly
finally
with
wrote
us
in our
3
confusion.
words.
The
You were
kind
right.
that holds space
He
for
folded
questions,
it, sealed
for
it,
longing,
but didn't send it.
for the soul's
It was enough
many
for now
contradictions,
to admit
and
it to
as
himself.
he scanned the faces of
Still,
his congregation,
sleep evaded
his
him.
gaze landed,
His thoughts
for a
circled
fleeting
in
moment,
loops
on
what
the
the bishop
third
might
pew
say
from the front.
what his congregation
Elias
might
had
feel,
returned,
what God might think.
not demanding,
But beneath
not
all
daring,
that fear was something
just
else.
waiting.
A
And
strange,
for the first time in
unwelcome
weeks,
hope.
Adrian
And
didn't
hope
feel like
Adrian
he was
knew
falling,
was
he
far
felt
more
like he
dangerous
was
than
choosing,
sin.
because it dared you to believe that something else might be possible. The next morning, as the church filled with the scent of fresh lilies and warm wax, Adrian stepped out into the sanctuary and saw Elias once again in the third pew. For the first time, Adrian didn't look away. The knock on Adrian's office door came just after evening vespers, sharp and deliberate. He recognized the rhythm before he heard the voice. Father Marcus, his superior, whose visits rarely came without intent. "Come in," Adrian said, closing the parish ledger with quiet care. Marcus entered with a folder tucked beneath his arm, his expression measured but unreadable. "I thought we should talk," he said, "about your homilies." Adrian gestured to the chair across from him, wary but calm. "Is there something in particular you want to discuss?" "They've changed," Marcus said simply, lowering himself into the seat. "There's more openness. Compassion. You speak as though you're reaching for something just beyond the pulpit." Adrian met his gaze. "Isn't it the point of preaching? To reach?" Marcus hesitated. "It's not a criticism. But people notice when a priest's heart begins to shift. When his voice trembles in places it never used to." Adrian said nothing. Silence, after all, was his first language, refuge and shield. But Marcus had been in the priesthood long enough to recognize the weight of words left unsaid. "There's a man," Marcus continued, voice low, "who attends Mass regularly now. Sits in the third pew. Alone. Watches you very closely." Adrian's chest tightened, but his expression didn't falter. "He's a parishioner like any other." Marcus didn't challenge the lie, but he didn't accept it either. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "I'm not here to condemn you, Adrian, but I've seen priests lose themselves trying to serve a truth they're too afraid to name." Adrian looked down at his hands. They were steady, though his heart wasn't. "I'm still who I've always been." "No," Marcus said gently. "You're not. And maybe that's the beginning of something holy, or maybe it's the start of a fracture. But it will demand something from you either way." That night, Adrian didn't eat. He wandered the chapel in circles, passing the stations of the cross without really seeing them. He had given his life to this path, to celibacy, to obedience, to the quiet nobility of self-denial. And for years, it had fulfilled him, until Elias. He had not asked for temptation. He had not welcomed it. But love had arrived like rainfall on dry soil, silent and inevitable. The next morning, Adrian found Elias waiting at the edge of the churchyard, hands in his pockets, face pale beneath the gray spring sky. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," Elias said. "I always want to see you," Adrian replied before he could stop himself. The honesty landed between them like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything they'd tried to contain. Elias looked away, eyes flickering over the rows of gravestones behind the chapel. "Then come with me. Just for a day. No sermons. No guilt. Just you and me and a place where none of this has to be decided yet." Adrian should have said no. Instead, he nodded. They drove an hour outside the city, to a small lakeside village Elias had visited as a child. The air smelled like pine and melting snow. The water was still too cold to touch, but the earth was waking, green and slow and hopeful. They walked along the shoreline in silence at first, their steps sinking without effort. Adrian watched the light catch in Elias's hair, the way he smiled at the sound of birdsong, the quiet reverence he carried for ordinary beauty. It wasn't the desire that undid him, it was the peace. The realization that here, in this borrowed moment, he could simply be a man. Not a shepherd. Not a symbol. Just a man with a heart that had long stopped asking permission to feel. They found a bench near the water. Adrian sat first, folding his hands tightly between his knees. "I've spent most of my life teaching others to deny themselves," he said. "To believe sacrifice is the highest form of love." "And now?" Elias asked softly. "Now I'm not sure if I've taught them how to live." Elias turned to him, eyes steady. "You don't have to choose today. But you do have to stop pretending the choice doesn't exist." The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting gold across the lake. Adrian watched the ripples, the quiet movements of the world continuing without his control. He wanted to stay. He wanted to believe that this didn't undo everything, that perhaps love wasn't a threat to faith, but part of it. But dusk would come, and with it, the caller and the silence, and the faces that looked to him for certainty. "I don't know how to leave," Adrian whispered. "And I don't know how to stay." Elias reached over, not to pull him closer, but to place a hand gently over Adrian's. "Then just be here," he said. "For now, just this." Adrian closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he breathed without fear. But the peace wouldn't last. And both of them knew it.